So in that sense, I want to democratize the story of innovation. I want to make it clear that anyone can do it.
The basic question that a writer asks, I think, is, what should I write about? And, that's the biggest question. There's no help for you either. And it's a total mystery.
But what is common throughout history, throughout time, is that when you have that upstairs, downstairs thing, there's a certain amount of that you can maintain if you're on top through hard power and hard system.
We're absolutely delighted to be back here with our edition, albeit digitally, of JLF Houston. There are so many wonderful authors and speakers who you will hear over the next few days. And I hope they will power your imagination as they have ours to look into the future, into a brighter tomorrow.
On behalf of Namita Gokhale, William Dalrymple, Sanjoy Roy, and all my colleagues at Teamwork Arts, Asia Society, and Inprint, we welcome you to the fourth session of JLF Houston 2021 Virtual Festival. Presenting Bottles of Pain, Sacklers, Ranbaxy, and the Dark Side of Pharma, Katherine Eban and Patrick Radden Keefe in conversation with Sanjoy K. Intertwining corporate avarice and the intergenerational empire behind the opioid crisis in America, a gripping and foreboding session that unravels the infestation seeped into the pharmaceutical industry. Investigative journalist Katherine Eban's shocking expose, Bottle of Lies, the inside story of the generic drug boom, follows the nuances of generic drug manufacturing and the attendant risks for global health. Rooted in accounts from whistleblowers and regulators and FDA documents, Eban unravels a cocoon of fraud, false data, and cost-cutting initiatives. Writer and journalist Patrick Radden Keefe's explosive new book, Empire of Pain, The Secret History of the Sackler Dynasty, traces the family's ambitions and ruthless methods and their role in the OxyContin epidemic, a disturbing narrative on American morality and ambition. The saga investigates the owners of Purdue Pharma and their complete disregard for human health. In conversation today with Sanjoy Roy. Katherine Eban, an investigative journalist, is a Vanity Fair contributing editor. Her articles on pharmaceutical counterfeiting, gun trafficking, and coercive CIA interrogations have won international attention and numerous awards. Her second book, Bottle of Lies, the inside story of the generic drug boom, was a New York Times bestseller. Patrick Radden Keefe is a staff writer for The New Yorker and author of the bestsellers Empire of Pain and Say Nothing. His work has been recognized with the National Magazine Award, the National Book Critics Circle Award, and the Orwell Prize. He also made the 8-part podcast Wind of Change. Sanjoy K. Roy, an entrepreneur of the arts, is the managing director of Teamwork Arts, which produces over 33 highly acclaimed performing arts, visual arts, and literary festivals in 40 cities across the world, including the iconic annual Jaipur Literature Festival, international editions of JLF, and the launch during lockdown digital series, JLF Brave New World. Roy works closely with various industry bodies and the government on policy issues in the cultural sector in India, and has lectured and collaborated with leading international universities. Please do follow our social media handles to get notifications on the upcoming sessions. In these difficult times, we've struggled to bring you JLF Houston 2021 without charging a registration fee. Please support us as generously as you can to ensure a free, seamless, and continuous flow of knowledge. Simply click on the Support JLF option button on the right-hand side of your screen. Your contribution is greatly appreciated. Ladies and gentlemen, Bottles of Pain, Sacklers, Ranbaxy, and the Dark Side of Pharma, Katherine Eban and Patrick Radden Keefe in conversation with Sanjoy K. Roy. Over to you, Sanjoy.
Thank you so much, Sharupa, and welcome, Catherine and Patrick, to JLF Houston. I'm not sure whether I should use the word enjoyed reading your book or whether I was just completely gobsmacked, horrified. I wanted to go to my medicine cabinet and throw out every last tablet that I'd been having for blood pressure or statins for my cholesterol. But it certainly brought home a message of where both books sort of really restate this about avarice, about personal ambition, about a lack of empathy for their own families, and all of the people who they're supposed to have helped through medication, medicine, scientific invention to have made the world a better place. But thank you both for joining us at JLF Houston. And when we started JLF Houston, one of our key focuses was that can we bring together the researchers in energy and health? And our thing to both these distinct organizations or distinct silos was that everybody finally did research on pumps and pipes, whether it was in the human body or it was in oil and gas. And we said, can that research in some way be brought together? So this session that we're doing together today is of particular importance because it really breaks the myth about science and what it's done for the human being. I'm going to start with you, Patrick. In many ways, money and ambition, and rather money and personal ambition, has been at the forefront of trying to, in many ways, circumvent the very rule of law, whether it's the FDA or it's the Senate or the Congress in America. Everything has been done by every individual to circumvent that. Do you see that this to be the single biggest issue in the pharma industry?
I do. I think it's a really major issue. I should say, first of all, it's a real pleasure to be with you, to have the opportunity to talk to my old friend Catherine, who's written this wonderful book that I so enjoyed reading when I initially read it, and that has had a big impact on me. And to talk with you, Sanjoy, and I'm grateful to all those of you joining us. I wish we could be doing it in person, but here we are. Yeah, I mean, what I was trying to do with this book was, on the one hand, tell a story about 3 generations of this one family, the Sackler family, which has been very involved in the pharmaceutical industry dating back as far as the 1940s and 50s. And what really struck me, to your point, is that in those early days, and this really starts in the kind of immediate post-war context in the late 1940s, early 1950s in New York, in which the big pharma as we know it today is kind of being born. This is in the aftermath of penicillin. You have these firms that are starting to come up with new branded drugs left and right and release them at a really furious pace, and to figure out how to sell them both to consumers, but also in some ways more importantly to physicians who will write the prescriptions. And what struck me about that period was that there was a sense that you have the practice of medicine, which I think we tend to think about in almost religious terms. I mean, you think of it as a kind of a sacred bond between the physician and the patient. And then you have commerce. And commerce is trying to kind of build a wedge between the patient and the physician and find ways to make money on that transaction. And I think that motive, which was a greed motive, was there kind of from the beginning. It was there at the birth of the industry as we know it today. And so I was looking quite closely at the issue of pharmaceutical marketing, how drugs are marketed. But I think there's other aspects of this that you can look at as well. And so in some ways, the early story, the prehistory that I describe in my book, I think it helps explain some of the phenomena, not just that you see in later years as I document with the opioid crisis, but also some of what you see in Catherine's book, that this kind of profit motive and the way in which it can hijack healthcare is a really powerful and I think pernicious thing.
So for those of you who are watching, Empire of Pain is what Patrick has written, and it truly is in Empire of Pain. Catherine, Patrick talks about branded drugs. You've talked about the generic drug industry, and the generic drug industry primarily being fueled in India and China. And what you uncovered is so horrific, and I can't find any other way to qualify what you've written in your book, The Bottle of Lies, which is right here. Tell us, how did you stumble upon this, and how did the whistleblower get through to you?
So first of all, let me just say it's just wonderful to participate in this. I wish we were in person, Sanjoy. It was, January of 2020 when we were in person in Jaipur. And Patrick, I've read every book that Patrick's written, so I'm a groupie because he's not only an incredible journalist, but a master storyteller. So anything becomes fascinating in his hands. But really, my investigation of what turned into Bottle of Lies began entirely by sort of happenstance, really. It was 2008, and I got a phone call from a radio show host named Joe Graydon. He's runs something called the People's Pharmacy on NPR. He said, and he knew my work because I've written about pharmaceuticals a lot. And he said, I'm just being besieged by phone calls and emails from patients who are complaining about their generic drugs. They complain about side effects. They complain that the drugs don't work. He is a pharmacologist by training. So he was sort of compelled enough by these accounts that he went to the FDA and spoke to officials there. And those officials were quite dismissive and said, well, it's probably psychosomatic. It's in their heads because if the shape of the pill changes or the color at the pharmacy, then they just think it doesn't work. So he didn't believe that. And he posed this question to me. He just said, what is wrong with the drugs? So I had no idea at the time that the answer, trying to find an answer to that question would take me almost a decade. But it did. I mean, it just sent me that question. That seemingly simple question sent me on a decade-long odyssey. But what I think was so important about the reporting journey is I started reporting with the doctors and patients, but really where I ended up was in the C-suites of these giant generic companies. And what I ended up uncovering was a story of corporate corruption. So that was the answer to the question of what was wrong with the drugs.
Catherine, you talk about what was wrong with the drugs. Patrick, this is not something new, and you've talked about it. You've written about it in your book. Pfizer bribing Henry Welch way back and talking about, the marketing of terramycin, where everybody's name, every doctor's name who was on that list endorsing the medicine didn't actually exist.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of astonishing when you look back at it, the degree to which that kind of influence has been there. So the big figure in the first third of my book is this guy, Arthur Sackler. And Arthur Sackler was one of three brothers. They were immigrants. They grew up in Brooklyn against the backdrop of the Great Depression. And the brothers all grew up wanting to become doctors, and they did. But they also wanted to be businessmen. And Arthur was this kind of marketing whiz. He was sort of a savant when it came to the ways in which you advertise and market drugs. So in fact, the first great Sackler fortune was actually made with the marketing of Valium, the blockbuster drug of its day. And Arthur Sackler completely designed the marketing campaign for that drug, which at the time became the most successful drug in the history of the industry. And so he became a very, very wealthy man doing that. But he also pioneered a series of these tactics, which were, I think, pretty shameful. And so, as you mentioned, there was an advertisement he had where he had this intuition that the person you really want to sell is not the patient. It's actually the doctor. You want to sell the physician on a new drug because the physician is the one who's going to write the prescriptions, and that the way to persuade one physician was generally by using another physician. And so that meant that there was a lot of kind of dubious medical research that his sales representatives would trot out, in which they would talk up the therapeutic benefits of drugs and talk down the possible side effects or downsides. And in some of these instances, there were advertisements that he ran. The one that you're referring to is one in which you had business cards for a series of doctors who supposedly endorsed a drug that he was selling. And there was an enterprising journalist, this is back in the 1950s, who called the numbers on the business cards and discovered that none of these doctors existed. So there were these, very basic forms of fraud going on, and then also some much more sophisticated forms of corruption in which the bribery episode you refer to is one in which there was a guy, Henry Welch, who was the head of the antibiotics division at the FDA, and a very powerful man in the industry. And Henry Welch was bribed by Pfizer, but it was in this quite indirect way. So what happened was that Arthur Sackler was the owner, the kind of silent partner in a couple of outside journals. And Henry Welch was offered a job on the side, in addition to his government duties, editing these journals. And the journals would sell reprints. And each time they sold reprints, Henry Welch would get some money for the reprint. And the pharma companies would buy hundreds of thousands of copies of these reprints of the journals, claiming that they needed them. But in fact, the reprints would just stack up in a storage room. They didn't have any real need for them. This was an indirect way to bribe Henry Welch. And Welch ends up getting found out and resigning in disgrace, and there's a congressional inquiry. But what struck me as I looked at the continuity between those early days in the 1950s and what happens today is that there's a great deal of corruption that is in some ways even more sophisticated. It's not illegal a lot of the time. I think this is the one of the real problems that we have in looking at the issues that this industry has and figuring out how to move forward. To give you just one example, when OxyContin, the drug that really helped spark the opioid crisis, was approved by the FDA decades later in the mid-1990s, the gentleman who was the main official at the FDA in charge of approving the drug ended up leaving shortly thereafter and going and working at Purdue Pharma, the Sacklers company, which produced the drug, for 3 times his government salary. And there is nothing illegal about that. Anybody who looks at that from the outside, I think, would say that's wildly inappropriate. That's pretty hard to justify, that a regulator would go and leave like that and get paid handsomely almost immediately after approving the drug. But this sort of thing, I'm afraid, happens with some frequency.
Katherine, exactly the same story. Patrick talked about the brothers Sackler. You looked at the brothers and the Ranbaxy thing. But here, unlike the slightly indirect thing where they were buying 250,000 or 25,000 copies of the magazine, here it was far more specific. The bribery and the corruption and the obfuscation of the information was very, very blatant and in your face. And yet, at the very same time that the FDA was trying to shut down Ranbaxy, they had to give permission for them to generate and produce a new drug. Why?
Yeah, it's astonishing. So first of all, one thing I was thinking about as I was listening to Patrick is there's so much in the pharmaceutical industry with branded drugs. There is so much sort of fraud and soft corruption around the marketing of drugs, which is a very important part of the story of OxyContin, sort of expanding the target patients for the drug and sort of shrinking the restrictions as far as it being non-addictive. But in the generic drug industry, it was a kind of fraud that I really could not have fathomed before I started reporting on it, which is the alteration of actual laboratory testing data and falsifying and sometimes wholly inventing that data when the drugs, in fact, had not been tested at all. so that the end result is that you are giving completely untested drugs to people all over the world, right? You've invented data, you've submitted that data to regulators, you've gotten market approvals. The drugs go out, and in fact, they have not been tested at all. So to your question, the main character in the book is a whistleblower named Dinesh Thakur. He sort of uncovered or sort of spelled out this remarkable fraud that was going on inside Ranbaxy. He was pushed out of the company. He contacts the FDA in August of 2005, saying, this crime is taking place, you have to put a stop to it. They begin to investigate slowly, but over the next 8 years, the FDA continues to approve one drug after another that Ranbaxy submits to them, including giving the green light to Ranbaxy for the largest generic drug launch in history, which was generic Lipitor. So anybody in the audience who took generic Lipitor when it first went generic in 2011, they were taking Ranbaxy's version of that because they got a 6-month exclusivity on that drug. So this was years after Dinesh Thakur contacted them. Ranbaxy ended up making, in the first 24 hours of that launch, they made $100 million. I mean, it's just mind-blowing, you know? And this was at a time when the FDA had full knowledge of the fraud inside the company. It's sort of a very complicated internecine story of why they ended up green lighting the drug. But, you know, it's just an extraordinary sort of miscarriage of regulatory authority that even happened at all.
Regulatory authority, Patrick, $100 million from Lipitor. Here too, in the case of Purdue, you've seen how the entire system was scammed, and there's no other word for it, whether it was Valium, whether it was betadine as these people came off the spaceship, and of course, OxyContin, which was the biggest thing. Here was an organization that had a marketing and an advertising organization linked to a pharma organization, linked to a magazine and a publication, all working hand in hand with the FDA. First through the door has been one of the biggest issues, as has been patents. Patents were put in place to safeguard big pharma so that they could put in that kind of money to be able to develop, investigate, create, etc. But it, in many ways, was counterproductive. How do you see it today?
I think it's a hard issue, the patent issue, because I do think that you need patent exclusivity in order to stimulate innovation. I believe as a general precept that is true. I also think, though, that when you look at patents and the way in which they end up governing so much of the behavior of these companies, what I found when I was kind of doing my detective work, I would look back over decades of behavior by Purdue Pharma and the Sacklers, and occasionally there would be a conundrum, something I couldn't understand. There's a story I tell in the book about how in fairly recent years, long after the opioid crisis was really raging, long after Purdue Pharma, the company, had pled guilty to federal criminal charges and paid a $600 million fine in 2007, the company was really pushing, the Sacklers were pushing, to get the FDA to approve OxyContin for use in children, among young kids. And I couldn't really understand it, and they were very sensitive about this. I wrote about it in the New Yorker, and they were very angry because they sort of resented the suggestion that that they were trying to peddle their drugs to kids and so forth. And they had a whole thing where they said to me in my back and forth with them, they said, oh, well, but we unilaterally said that we wouldn't market directly for children, as though that deserved a gold star. And it took a long time before I found some internal emails, and I found an inside source who told me, oh, the whole reason that they did that was that the FDA has created an incentive for pharma companies to do the clinical research in order to get what's called the pediatric indication, when you can get an indication for the drug for children. And in this case, what it meant was 6 months of additional patent exclusivity. So the original patents on OxyContin were close to running out, and they were looking for an extension. They were looking for a way to extend. You have a similar moment in the story when, for those who don't know, I mean, one of the issues with OxyContin was that it was a powerful opioid painkiller with a control release mechanism. So it was a pill that would give you a huge dose of the drug, but in theory, it would slowly release into your bloodstream over the course of 12 hours. And what happened was people who became addicted to the drug were grinding it up or sucking off the coating in order to get the whole hit right away. They would snort it, or sometimes they would shoot it, actually, or even just crush the pill with their teeth and eat it. And eventually, in 2010, so this is 14 years after OxyContin is originally released, Purdue rolls out a reformulation, which is harder to abuse. And it's this fascinating moment because when they roll out this new version of the pill that can't be crushed, sales of the top dose, the 80 milligram pills, immediately drop 25% nationwide, which should have told the company, would tell anybody with eyes in their head that 25% of the profits from those pills were coming from people who were abusing them. But the timing is really interesting because you wonder, well, why did it take them so long to do this? And it turns out that the patents were about to run out. And what they found is when they do this reformulation, they call it evergreening a patent. It's a way of starting the clock again on the patent. So they wait until the original patents are going to run out, introduce the new reformulated pills, and then this is the really crazy thing on the generic note. Because the patents on the original formulation were soon going to run out, Purdue then turned to the FDA and said, we know that for 14 years we've been saying that original version is actually safe. But now that we've introduced this new version, we've changed our minds, and the version we've been selling for the last 14 years really isn't safe at all. So you shouldn't allow any generic companies to produce that version when it comes off patent. And the FDA, which just obliges them again and again and again, says, gosh, when you put it that way, we agree with you. So we're going to allow you to sell the new version, the crush-proof version, and turn around and say that the version that we've allowed you to sell for the last 14 years is actually so dangerous compared to your new version that there can't be any generic companies allowed to make it.
Katherine, Patrick talked about $600 million. Ranbaxy paid up $500 million as fines. It was the same thing, right? They created a drug, they brought it back, you found crushed glass in it.
Yeah.
When they looked at researching what was happening, it's not that they recalled the drug. They were just trying to crush the powder the glass even finer and reintroduce it.
Right.
What was fascinating in the reading was that how different formulations of the drugs were being sold by Ranbaxy to Africa and other Eastern countries. And you talk about how if a 5 milligram drug was effective, say, in the United States, if it was in Africa, you had to, the same drug had to be administered at 25 grams. The question that I have for you and Patrick both is that greed, the medical oath to save a life, doesn't seem to have permeated any of this business. And it is a business, and it must be a business because that's the way we see the world. But is that the way forward in the future? Does medicine have to be seen to be the stock market? Do we need to find a different way to be able to ensure, especially when we're revisiting a pandemic 100 years later, with very few learnings from what had transpired? What do we need to do?
So let me just first start by saying that that was one of the big stunners to me as I did my investigating. You know, my assumption, even with all of my coverage of the pharma industry, my assumption was always a pill is a pill. You know, if you buy it in New York or you buy it in Hyderabad, if it's Lipitor at, 10 milligrams or whatever it is, then it's the same thing. And that is actually completely untrue, because what these generic companies do is they adjust the quality of the drug, the quality of the testing, and the quality of the ingredients depending on the market they're selling into, which is just stunning. So basically, the manufacturing standard is whatever they can get away with. If they're selling into a highly regulated market like the US or Europe, then they're going to be doing much more testing of it, and they're actually making it in different facilities. Whereas, and tragically, if they're selling it into Africa or even selling it into India, even if it's an Indian company, they will, one character inside Ranbaxy told the whistleblower, Dinesh Thakur, oh, when we sell it into the Indian market, we don't test it at all. And we just invent all the data because the regulators don't check it. So, that was really stunning. And I think, from my experience of my book tour in India was really confirmatory for, I think, Indian readers that they suspected that the drugs they're getting are of a low quality, and it's tragically true. So, how do you address this going forward? There is this terrible, corrupt attitude, not in every drug company, but in many of them. I recount this meeting that happened inside of Ranbaxy where an American scientist who worked for the company was on a conference call, and the medical director, she raised concerns about the quality of the HIV drugs that were being made for the African market. And the medical director said, who cares? It's just blacks dying, which is an extraordinary attitude. It's insane for somebody who is making allegedly life-saving pharmaceuticals to have. So what I'm beginning to see now, and if I have any hope at all, you're beginning to see more not-for-profit manufacturing models. There's a couple of examples in the US, partly that was being driven by really severe drug shortages that have happened in the generic industry. And so there are a couple of entities now that have developed a not-for-profit model. They're ramping up manufacturing, and it's just a very different, a different thing. Once you take the profit motive out of it, and you try to somehow marry up the market and the quality and all of that, you can manufacture in your own neighborhood, as it were, in your own backyard, at a sort of, not-for-profit model with a less of a drive to the bottom line. So I think some hope lies in that idea,
Patrick, Catherine says, who cares? Or she quotes, who cares? Blacks are dying. Well, in this case, people are dying. Sackler marketed heroin, morphine in all its many forms, and people died. Just taking it forward and putting you on the spot today, we're looking at the pandemic, we're looking at vaccines, we're looking at anti-vaxxers. I've just returned from France and Spain, where every Saturday and Sunday, there's still anti-vaxxers out on the street. Of course, in America, this has become a fine art to question. The question that I have for you is that, given both your books and the mistrust that Big Pharma has, in a way, not just inherited, it's worked effectively to be able to be that giant, amorphous, secretive organization that creates drugs that kill. how do we need to look at the issue around vaccine, especially in the light of what Katherine talked about? She said in some countries, you create drugs for a particular level of admission, like the FDA. In other countries where there isn't that kind of level, you just release it into the market. What do we need to understand in this?
Yeah, I mean, let me start by actually touching on something from your last question, but then I'll land on this issue of vaccines because I think they're connected. So you had asked about the Hippocratic Oath and how do we reform this industry that's so cravenly profit-seeking that it can be that callous, that you can hear sentiments like the one Katherine quoted. And one answer in my mind that is fairly straightforward and obvious is you talked about, we've both just talked about rather large monetary fines. And I tend to believe that fines are not enough. There's a story I tell in my book about that 2007 guilty plea by Purdue Pharma, the company, where they paid $600 million to the federal government, and nobody went to jail. There were 3 executives who pled guilty to misdemeanors, but nobody was really in real jeopardy. And at the time, there was an American senator from Pennsylvania who, kind of just thinking out loud in a hearing, said, I wonder whether if you have a corporation and it behaves in this kind of craven way, but there are billions of dollars to be made, whether a fine, even a $600 million fine, isn't just an expensive license for criminal misconduct, whether a fine isn't just a speeding ticket, in effect. And he asked that question in 2007, and you can see how in 2007 the question would be, well, will the company reform itself? Is this enough of a slap on the wrist? So it turns out that for Purdue Pharma, it wasn't. They actually recently pled guilty to a whole new set of federal criminal charges, doing a lot of the same stuff that they got in trouble for back in 2007. And the period of time in which this bad conduct was happening was about a decade leading up to 2020. So it's essentially the case that they paid the $600 million fine and then went right back to the kind of bad behavior that they had been doing. I think the only way that you will change the behavior of corporations is to have real criminal jeopardy for executives. I think if they think that there's a possibility that they will go to prison, which is certainly in this country what happens to all kinds of people who commit the tiniest of street drug crimes with illicit drugs, I think if there were that kind of risk of criminal sanction, you actually would see a change in behavior. I think in a system where selfishness always finds a way, you need to appeal to the selfish interests of those individual executives.
Patrick, let me hold you there for 1 second and I'll come back to the vaccine question. Katherine, he says that if you send them to jail, maybe it'll change. Ranbaxy's present ownership or former ownership is sitting in jail. Has anything changed? Will anything change in China in terms of generic drugs? Do we need more Patricks, Katherines, Bakers to be able to do this investigation, to be able to bring people to the book? And having brought them to the book, will the law take its course?
Look, I mean, I agree 100% with what Patrick said. You have to send executives to prison. But the issue, one of the big issues is whether companies think they're going to get caught or not, right? So what was happening in India was that you have all of these big generic companies that are making drugs for the US market, and the US FDA was inspecting these plants, and a lot of people
with advance notice. With advance notice.
I'm getting to that, right? So in the US, the FDA doesn't tell you when they're coming. They show up unannounced. They stay as long as is needed. But in India, the US FDA would call them up, say, we want to come in 2 months' time. Is such and such a date okay for you, right? Oh, great. Okay, so you're going to invite us. We're going to get an invitation letter from you guys. And could you also help us out by booking our ground travel and our hotels, right? So you would have this situation where these FDA inspectors would show up at the airport in India, in Delhi or in wherever, and they would be met by luxury vehicles. They'd be taken to a hotel where their rooms would be magically upgraded, right? And then these plants would know, okay, they've painted, they've gotten rid of the snakes and the lizards and the birds and all of that, and they've faked all the data. They brought in data falsification teams. I mean, I actually did uncover this. They would have data falsification teams that would come in, shred documents, tow them out in garbage bags, put all their shredders on trucks and send them out through the parking lots. They would do all of that. They'd invent, microbial testing data that showed the plants were clean and sanitary. But then they would know, okay, the FDA inspectors are only supposed to be there for 4 days. So let's give them like tainted tap water in their Poland Spring bottles or their water bottles. And then they'd be sick 2 of those 4 days. So they're running out the clock, right? You'd have this extraordinary set of circumstances where it was like kabuki theater. What the FDA was seeing in the plants had nothing to do with it. So, my point is, if they think they can get away with it, and in that situation they can get away with it, then they'll just behave however. So fast forward to COVID, and the FDA inspectors could not travel abroad, right? So I'm sure all the manufacturing plants in India breathed a sigh of relief. God only knows what's going on inside those plants now, because the FDA hasn't even started its foreign inspections up again. But then the FDA sent out a press release saying, well, we can't go and inspect the plants, but don't worry, it's okay because the plants are sharing their manufacturing data with us. And it's
Patrick, don't worry, it's okay. Is it okay today in terms of vaccinations?
Well, I mean, where I was gonna land, and Katherine has kind of taken us there, is that for me the one long-term cost that slowly accumulates in the background and may not appear on the balance sheet of these pharma companies, but is very real, is a credibility gap. That, after years and years of this kind of behavior of the sort that Katherine demonstrates so powerfully in her book and documents, and behavior of the sort that I get into in mine, you end up in a situation in which there is deep and understandable distrust of this industry, of the industry's motives and its approach to best practices. And I think that's, it's by no means the only explanation for the deep degree of vaccine hesitancy that we see in the U.S. now. I think, listen, you talked about people in Spain and France. Give me what they have. Give me people protesting on the weekends. We have a really severe problem here in which you have this kind of, this, I think, atrocious situation in which the vaccines are available at a level that they aren't in so many other parts of the world, and people are refusing to take them. But I do think that part of what explains that is deep and long-standing and growing skepticism about this industry, and also about the integrity of the FDA as a regulatory agency. So it puts me in an awkward situation. My book, as you said, tells the story of Pfizer bribing an FDA official, and the book came out after I'd had my first Pfizer shot and before I got my second one. And I've had questions all along the line about whether or not people should be so skeptical of this industry that they shouldn't get their shots. And I say, of course you should. But I think it is this interesting moment in which, in some ways, the development of these vaccines, leaving aside for a moment the terrifying questions that Katherine's asking about quality control, the rapid development of effective vaccines in such a short period of time for a global pandemic should be the finest hour of this industry. And yet you end up in a situation in which, in really large, dangerous numbers, people are saying, no thanks, I prefer not to get it. And to me, that is a cost of the kind of behavior that we're writing about that is only now manifesting itself.
It should be the finest hour of the industry. Truly, in this last 18 months, from pandemic to vaccine, the world has gone through an enormous change. And yet we know that the one way forward for medicine and development and scientific progress and research is about the average Joe on the street asking that question, demanding an answer, demanding his or her representative in parliament or government responds to them with a considered opinion, and ensuring that regulatory bodies are responsible and are taken to task for the drugs that we consume. Patrick, Katherine, I wish this could go on for a number of more sessions. Unfortunately, we run out of time. Lisa, Kabir, Maya, all of you have asked questions. I'm really sorry that I haven't been able to take them. This has been a fascinating discussion. For more on both these issues, my suggestion is please pick up a book, Bottle of Lies and The Empire of Pain. In this case, they're both reversed. I hope the situation reverses. And a decade later, we're back here talking about the pharmaceutical industry, as Patrick said, in glowing terms. But till then, be cautious, be considered, be aware, and most importantly, be informed. It's not enough anymore to say, I was told, or I received this from WhatsApp, or somebody told me. Do your research, speak with your doctor, question your doctor when he or she is providing you any medication. Ask for its antecedents. Maybe we will get a better tomorrow for our kids. Patrick, Katherine, thank you so much. Sharupa, back to you.
Thank you, Katherine, Patrick, and Sanjoy for shedding light on the disturbing realities of the pharmaceutical industry. Thank you all for watching and being a great audience. We encourage you to buy the books of our speakers that are available through Brazos Bookstore. If you like the session, please do consider supporting us through the Support GLF option button on the right-hand side of your screen. We sincerely value your contributions. We'd like to thank all our JLF Houston advisors, donors, and partners for generously supporting us. We hope you all enjoyed this conversation and will tune in for the next session, The Wrong End of the Telescope, Rabi Alamuddin in conversation with Alia Malik. This will be at 2 p.m. Central Time, which is 12:30 a.m. IST, 12 p.m. Pacific Time, 1 p.m. Mountain Time, and 3 p.m. Eastern Time. Thank you. And now presenting a reading from the JLF Writer Show.
हूँ गर्मीए निशाते तसव्वुर से नग़्मा संज मैं अंदलीबे गुलशने ना आफरीदा हूँ. I sing from the heat of my lively creative imagination. I am a bird of a yet-to-be-born garden. These are lines from one of Ghalib's very famous ghazals. I've used one of these lines as a title to one of my poems. I'm a bird of a yet-to-be-born garden. The poem was written in response to the Bavarian State Symphony Orchestra conducted in Shalimar Gardens, Srinagar in September 2013. Maestro Zubin Mehta, like the modern-day Pied Piper, enticed the VVIPs from Delhi and Mumbai and all over to fly down to Srinagar to attend the concert. A 10-kilometer security ring around the Shalimar Garden kept the locals away. The concert was called Ehsaas-e Kashmir, the feelings of Kashmir. I'm a bird of a yet-to-be-born garden. No, I'm not an artist. For art seeks leisure. My need is immediate. I'm trying to steal your shadow, running against time, trying to hold water in a wicker basket as we once did. I'm trying to save your myths in my palms, but my hands are too small. I'm afraid myths might slip or hands may leak. I'm racing with whales before they fly away like birds without reaching half-deaf ears. I tried to safeguard your ghazals sun-dried with chili peppers for winter, wrapped in obituaries of our poets who died too young. These are for Agha Shahid Ali. Wrapped in obituaries of our poets who died too young. I'm forcing memory to resurrect lines buried in dusty newspapers, in gloomy archive centers. I so wish one day I could free those lines, create my own lyrics, leaving no scope for a pale orchestra playing the Shalimar, concert goers hedged by concertina wires.
So in that sense, I want to democratize the story of innovation. I want to make it clear that anyone can do it.
The basic question that a writer asks, I think, is, what should I write about? And, that's the biggest question. There's no help for you either. And it's a total mystery.
But what is common throughout history, throughout time, is that when you have that upstairs, downstairs thing, there's a certain amount of that you can maintain if you're on top through hard power and hard system.
We're absolutely delighted to be back here with our edition, albeit digitally, of JLF Houston. There are so many wonderful authors and speakers who you will hear over the next few days. And I hope they will power your imagination as they have ours to look into the future, into a brighter tomorrow.